The scream that tore through the quiet suburban morning wasn't just any scream. It was the kind that freezes blood in your veins, the kind that makes neighbors drop their coffee cups and rush to windows. I was in my home office, reviewing depositions for the Henderson case, when that sound shattered my concentration like glass hitting concrete. By the time I reached the front door, my heart was already pounding. What I saw in my driveway made my legal training kick into overdrive, even as my father's instincts roared to life. There was my 12-year-old son, Marcus, sprawled behind our rose bushes, his walker tossed carelessly into the recycling bin 15 feet away. Standing over him was Linda Peterson, our HOA president, her manicured fingers still clenched in fists, her face twisted with disgust. "I told you to keep that eyesore out of public view," she was shrieking at Marcus, who sat there stunned, paint still wet on his fingers from the canvas that now lay torn beside him. "This is a respectable neighborhood, not some charity ward." The morning had started so peacefully. Marcus had been excited about his art therapy assignment, something his occupational therapist had recommended to help with his fine motor skills after the accident that had damaged his spinal cord 2 years ago. He'd chosen a spot near our mailbox where the morning light hit just right, set up his easel with the careful precision that took him twice as long as other kids, but filled him with such pride when he got it perfect. I'd watched him from the kitchen window as I made breakfast, noting how he'd positioned his walker within easy reach, how he'd arranged his paints in the order his therapist had taught him. The concentration on his face as he mixed colors was pure joy. It was moments like these that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to make our home accessible, why I'd researched the best schools, why I'd dedicated my career to ensuring people like my son had the same opportunities as everyone else. But now that peaceful morning lay shattered like Marcus's canvas, and Linda Peterson was still talking. "Do you have any idea what this does to property values?" she continued, gesturing wildly at Marcus as if he were an inanimate object. "People don't want to see this when they're considering buying in Willowbrook Estates." I stepped outside, my bare feet hitting the cold concrete of our driveway. "Mrs. Peterson, what exactly is happening here?" She whirled around, her artificially enhanced lips twisted in a sneer. "Oh, perfect. The father arrives. I've been trying to explain to your son that his little art project is inappropriate for our community standards." "Inappropriate how?" I kept my voice level, though every fiber of my being wanted to scream. 20 years of courtroom experience had taught me that losing control only weakened your position. "Look at him." Linda's voice rose to a pitch that probably had dogs howling 3 blocks away. "Sitting there with all that equipment, it's unsightly. The HOA covenant clearly states that residents must maintain aesthetic standards." Marcus was trying to stand, struggling without his walker. I moved toward him, but Linda stepped in my path. "Don't you dare ignore me, Mr. Williams. I'm talking to you. And I'm trying to help my son." I kept moving, gently pushing past her to reach Marcus. His eyes were wide with confusion and hurt, the kind of expression that breaks a parent's heart into 1,000 pieces. "Dad, I was just painting," he whispered as I helped him to his feet. "She said I was ruining everything." I retrieved his walker from the recycling bin, noting the dent in the side where Linda had thrown it. The medical supply company had custom-fitted this walker to Marcus's specific needs. It wasn't just equipment. It was freedom, independence, dignity. "Mrs. Peterson," I said, turning back to face her, "my son has every right to use our property, including the area near our driveway. Not when it affects the whole community." She crossed her arms, her bangles jangling like warning bells. "I've had 3 complaints already this morning. The Hendersons said it made them uncomfortable walking their dog past here. The Kowalskis mentioned it when they were leaving for tennis. I felt something cold settle in my chest. In 2 decades of practicing civil rights law, I'd heard every excuse, every rationalization, every attempt to disguise discrimination as concern for community standards. But hearing it, directed at my own child, in my own neighborhood, was different. This wasn't a case file or a deposition. This was personal. What exactly made them uncomfortable? I asked. Linda's face flushed red. Well, you know, it's just, people don't want to be reminded of unpleasant things when they're trying to enjoy their morning. Unpleasant things. Disability. The word exploded from her lips, like she'd been holding it back with physical force. There, I said it. People don't want to see disability when they're trying to relax. It's depressing. It's a reminder of everything that can go wrong. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Marcus's small hand found mine, and I could feel him trembling. Mrs. Peterson, I said slowly, I think you should leave our property now. Oh, I'll leave, she said. But she wasn't moving. Instead, she was getting more agitated, more aggressive. But this isn't over. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting. We're going to address this situation once and for all. She bent down and picked up the torn remains of Marcus's canvas, holding it up like evidence in a trial. This is what I'm talking about. Messy, unprofessional, not the image we want for Willowbrook Estates. With a violent motion, she ripped the canvas completely in half. Paint splattered across the concrete, and Marcus let out a small sob. That took me 3 hours, he whispered. Linda threw the pieces into our garbage can. Maybe next time you'll think twice about making a spectacle of yourself. Something snapped inside me. Not my professional composure. Not yet. But something deeper. The part of me that had stayed up nights researching accessibility laws, that had fought insurance companies and school districts and medical providers, the part that had sworn my son would never face the kind of discrimination I'd seen too many others endure. Get off my property, I said, and this time my voice carried the authority I'd developed in 20 years of practice. Now. Linda's eyes narrowed. Or what you'll sue me. She laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the houses around us. Go ahead, try it. I've been HOA president for 8 years. I know my rights. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. And Williams. Next time I see that boy making a scene in public view, I'm calling the authorities. There are laws about public disturbances. After she left, I helped Marcus gather his remaining art supplies. His hands were shaking as he packed his paints, and I could see him fighting back tears. Dad, am I really an eyesore? He asked as we headed back inside. I stopped walking and knelt down so we were eye to eye. Marcus, listen to me very carefully. You are not an eyesore. You are not a disturbance. You are not unpleasant or depressing, or any of the other things that woman said. You are my son, and you have every right to exist in this world exactly as you are. He nodded, but I could see the damage was done. Mrs. Peterson's words had found their mark in the way that cruel words always do with children, settling in places where they would whisper doubts for years to come. That afternoon, while Marcus was at physical therapy, I made some phone calls. First to my assistant, asking her to pull everything we had on HOA discrimination cases. Then to the State Attorney General's office, to a colleague who specialized in disability rights violations. Finally, to the local disability advocacy group, to see if anyone else in the area had experienced similar treatment. What I learned over the next few days made my stomach turn. Mrs. Peterson had a history. 3 families in our subdivision had moved away in the past 2 years, after what they described as harassment campaigns. The Johnsons, whose teenage daughter had Down syndrome. The Martinez family, whose grandfather used a wheelchair after his stroke. The Patels, whose son had autism and sometimes stimmed in their front yard. Each family had been told their loved ones were affecting property values. Each had been pressured to keep their family members out of sight. Each had eventually given up and left rather than continue fighting. But they hadn't known what I knew. They hadn't realized that what was happening to them was a federal crime. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center. Linda Peterson had sent out a notice to all residents, complete with photos she'd apparently taken of Marcus painting, his walker clearly visible in each shot. The notice was titled, "Addressing Community Standards and Property Value Concerns." I spent that week preparing like I was heading into the biggest trial of my career. Because, in many ways, I was... Marcus asked if he could come to the meeting. "Are you sure?" I asked him. "It might be difficult to hear what people say." "I want to be there," he said with a determination that reminded me of his mother. She was talking about me. Shouldn't I get to defend myself? Thursday evening arrived gray and drizzling. The community center parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Cars spilling out onto the street. Word had gotten out about the meeting, and it seemed like half the subdivision had turned up to see the show. Inside, the meeting room buzzed with conversation that died to whispers as Marcus and I entered. I could feel eyes tracking our movement as we found seats in the middle section. Marcus had insisted on bringing his walker rather than using his wheelchair, wanting to show everyone that he was capable of moving independently. Linda Peterson stood at the front of the room behind a small podium, dressed in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. She looked confident, prepared, like someone who was used to getting her way. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice carrying easily through the room's sound system. "We're here to address a serious concern that affects every one of us as property owners in Willowbrook Estates." She clicked a remote, and a screen behind her lit up with one of the photos she'd taken of Marcus. The image was clearly taken from across the street with a telephoto lens, making Marcus's walker look somehow more prominent, more medical, more other than it did in real life. "As you can see," Linda continued, "we have a situation where our community standards are being compromised. While we all sympathize with individual challenges, we must consider the impact on our neighborhood's appeal and property values." A murmur ran through the crowd. I saw heads nodding, heard whispered agreements. These were my neighbors, people I'd waved to at the grocery store, whose kids had played with Marcus at the community pool, and they were agreeing that my son was a problem to be solved. "The HOA covenant is clear," Linda went on, pulling up a document on the screen. Section 4.7 states that residents must maintain their properties in a manner consistent with community aesthetic standards. This includes any activities or displays visible from public areas. She clicked to another photo, this one showing Marcus's art supplies arranged on his portable table. What we're seeing here is a pattern of behavior that disrupts the visual harmony of our neighborhood. Medical equipment, therapy activities, and other reminders of personal difficulties should be conducted in private areas, not in full view of the community. I felt Marcus tense beside me. His breathing had gotten shallow, the way it did when he was trying not to cry. "Furthermore," Linda continued, warming to her theme, "we must consider the psychological impact on other residents, particularly children, who may be disturbed or frightened by these displays." That was when Margaret Henderson stood up. Margaret was 73, had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, and had never missed a community event. Her grandson had been Marcus's best friend before the accident. Linda Peterson, I have never heard such garbage in my entire life, Margaret said, her voice shaking with anger. That boy has been nothing but polite and sweet to everyone in this neighborhood. The only thing disturbing here is listening to you talk about a child like he's some kind of problem to be hidden away. A few people applauded, but Linda held up her hand for silence. Mrs. Henderson, I understand your emotions, but we need to approach this logically. I've consulted with real estate professionals, and they've confirmed that visible signs of disability can impact property values by as much as 15%. Show us the studies, called out Tom Martinez from the back of the room. I recognized him as someone who'd moved into the neighborhood just 6 months ago. Show us actual data supporting these claims. Linda's face flushed slightly. I don't need to provide detailed research to concerned homeowners. We all know what affects property values. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, letting my presence register with the room before I spoke. Actually, Mrs. Peterson, if you're going to make legal claims about property values and community standards, you do need to provide evidence, especially when those claims involve potential discrimination. The room went quiet. Linda's eyes narrowed as she focused on me. Mr. Williams, you're out of order. This is my meeting. No, ma'am. This is a community meeting about my son. I think I have a right to speak. I walked to the front of the room, Marcus following beside me with his walker. With each step, I could feel the weight of everyone's attention. The mixture of curiosity and tension that comes when people sense something important is about to happen. For those who don't know me well, my name is David Williams. I've lived in Willowbrook Estates for 4 years, and I work as a civil rights attorney for the state of Georgia. I heard a few sharp intakes of breath, saw Linda Peterson's confident expression flicker slightly. More specifically, I'm the lead litigator for disability rights cases in the State Attorney General's office. I've spent the last 20 years prosecuting exactly the kind of discrimination we're discussing tonight. The room was dead silent now. Linda Peterson's face had gone pale. Mrs. Peterson, everything you've said tonight constitutes a clear violation of the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and several state anti-discrimination statutes. You've documented your discrimination with photographs. You've stated explicitly that you want to exclude people with disabilities from public view, and you've attempted to use HOA authority to enforce that exclusion. I pulled out my phone and held it up. I've been recording this meeting, as is my right under Georgia's one-party consent laws. Everything you've said tonight is now evidence in what will become a federal civil rights case. Linda Peterson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You can't. This is a private meeting. This is a public meeting about community policy, Mrs. Peterson. And even if it weren't, recording someone violating federal law is always permissible. I turned to address the room. I want everyone here to understand something very clearly. What Mrs. Peterson has proposed tonight isn't just morally wrong, it's criminal. The Fair Housing Act specifically prohibits discrimination based on disability in housing-related activities, including HOA policies. The penalties include substantial fines, mandatory training, and, in severe cases, federal prosecution. Margaret Henderson started clapping, and others joined in. But not everyone. I could see some residents looking uncomfortable, perhaps realizing that their earlier nods of agreement had put them on the wrong side of federal law. Furthermore, I continued, I've spent the past week investigating similar incidents in our community. I've spoken with 3 families who were driven out of Willowbrook Estates by harassment campaigns, targeting their disabled family members. Each of those families has agreed to participate in a class action lawsuit against this HOA and its leadership. The murmur that ran through the crowd now was different. Worried rather than excited. People were starting to understand the implications of what had been happening in their community. Linda Peterson found her voice again. "This is ridiculous. I was trying to protect our property values. Everything I did was within my authority as HOA president." "Mrs. Peterson, you physically assaulted my son. You grabbed him by his shirt and pulled him behind bushes because you didn't want him visible from the street. You destroyed his artwork and threw his medical equipment in the trash. None of that falls within any legitimate HOA authority." I pulled up the video on my phone, the one I'd taken from our security camera footage. "I have it all on video. Mrs. Peterson, every moment of your attack on a disabled child." The video played on my phone's small screen, but the room was quiet enough that everyone could hear the audio clearly. Linda's voice, shrill with anger. "Keep that eyesore out of public view." The sound of Marcus crying. The crash of his walker hitting the recycling bin. When the video ended, the silence was complete. Linda Peterson looked around the room desperately, seeking support that was no longer there. I was just trying to do what was best for the community." "What's best for the community," I said firmly, "is treating all residents with dignity and respect, regardless of their abilities or disabilities. What's best for the community is following federal law." Marcus stepped forward then, his voice small but clear in the quiet room. "I just wanted to paint. I wasn't hurting anyone." The simple honesty of his words seemed to break something in the room. Several people were crying openly now, and I could see shame on faces that had been nodding along with Linda's presentation just minutes before. Tom Martinez stood up again. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in our current HOA leadership." "Seconded," called Margaret Henderson. The vote was swift and decisive. Linda Peterson was removed from her position by a margin of 47-3, with 2 abstentions. The new interim board immediately passed a resolution affirming the community's commitment to inclusion and accessibility. But the legal consequences were just beginning. Within a week, the story had gone viral. A local news station picked up the story of the HOA president who attacked a disabled child, and it spread from there. The video of Linda Peterson's assault on Marcus played on national news programs, and the audio of her discriminatory statements became a textbook example of housing discrimination in law schools across the country. The Department of Justice opened an investigation into the HOA's practices. The State Attorney General's office, my own employer, filed charges for assault, harassment, and civil rights violations. The class action lawsuit grew to include 7 families who had experienced discrimination in communities managed by the same company that handled Willowbrook Estates. Linda Peterson's life unraveled quickly. Her husband, a banker who couldn't afford to be associated with a federal civil rights case, filed for divorce. Her country club membership was revoked. The lawsuit settlements, combined with legal fees and federal fines, forced her to sell her house and move to a small apartment across town. But perhaps most importantly, her name was added to a national database of individuals banned from serving in HOA leadership positions. A database that was created partly as a result of our case and the attention it brought to HOA abuse. The settlements provided funding for accessibility improvements throughout Willowbrook Estates. Sidewalks were widened, curb cuts were added, and the community center was renovated to exceed ADA requirements. The money also funded a scholarship program for disabled students pursuing higher education. Marcus used his portion of the settlement to start an art program for kids with disabilities at the local community center. He called it Visible Voices, and it became a space where children could create art without fear of judgment or harassment. 6 months later, I was standing in our driveway again, watching Marcus paint. This time, though, he wasn't alone. 3 other kids from the neighborhood had joined him, their easels set up in a neat row near our mailbox. The morning light was perfect, just as it had been that terrible day, but everything else was different. Mrs. Henderson walked by with her dog and stopped to admire their work. "That's beautiful. Marcus, are you planning to enter it in the county art fair?" "Maybe," Marcus said, stepping back to examine his canvas. "Dad says I should be proud of my art." "Your dad is absolutely right," she said, winking at me. "Art is meant to be seen and celebrated." As she continued her walk, Marcus looked up at me. "Dad, do you think Mrs. Peterson was just scared?" It was a question that had taken him months to ask, and I'd been dreading it because the answer was complicated. I think she was scared. Yes, but being scared doesn't give anyone the right to hurt other people. "Do you think she learned anything?" I considered this carefully. Linda Peterson had been required to complete sensitivity training as part of her plea agreement, and she'd written a formal apology letter that her lawyer had crafted to avoid further legal liability. But had she really learned? Had she genuinely changed? Or was she simply complying with court orders? I don't know. Son, I hope so. But what I do know is that other people learned from what happened. Other kids like you won't have to go through what you went through, because people saw what happened and decided to do better. Marcus nodded thoughtfully and returned to his painting. The canvas showed our neighborhood street, but in his version. The sidewalks were filled with people of all kinds, some walking, some using wheelchairs, some with guide dogs, some signing to each other. It was his vision of what a community could be when it embraced everyone. That evening, as we cleaned up the art supplies, I reflected on how much had changed in 6 months, not just for our family, but for our entire community. The new HOA board had implemented policies that went far beyond legal compliance, creating a genuinely inclusive environment where differences were celebrated rather than hidden. Property values, ironically, had actually increased. It turned out that communities known for their inclusivity and strong civil rights protections were attractive to many homebuyers, particularly younger families who valued diversity and social justice. The case had also changed my own career trajectory. The Department of Justice had offered me a position heading up their new HOA Discrimination Task Force, a national initiative to address the growing problem of housing discrimination in managed communities. It was an opportunity to take the lessons learned from our experience and apply them on a national scale. As we headed inside for dinner, Marcus paused at the front door. "Dad, I'm glad you're a lawyer." "Why's that, buddy?" "Because you knew how to make the bad stuff stop. Not everyone knows how to do that." He was right. Of course, not every family had the legal knowledge and resources to fight back against discrimination. That's what made cases like ours so important. They established precedents and created protections that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The story of Linda Peterson and her attack on Marcus became part of the curriculum at the law school, where I occasionally guest lectured. Students would watch the video evidence and analyze the legal strategies. But I always made sure they understood that behind every civil rights case was a real person who had been hurt by discrimination. Years later, when Marcus was in high school and applying to colleges, he wrote his application essay about that morning in our driveway. Not about being a victim, but about learning that ordinary people could make extraordinary changes when they refused to accept injustice. He was accepted to his first-choice school with a full scholarship, and he majored in social work with a focus on disability advocacy. His Visible Voices program had grown into a statewide initiative, and he was already planning to expand it nationally during his college years. The morning I dropped him off at college, I drove past our old house in Willowbrook Estates. The new owners, a young family with a daughter who had cerebral palsy, had continued the tradition of sidewalk art. Their daughter's colorful chalk drawings covered the entire driveway approach, visible and celebrated by everyone who passed by. Linda Peterson had moved away years ago, but her legacy remained in the form of stronger protections and a more inclusive community. Sometimes I wondered if she ever thought about that morning, if she ever understood how her moment of cruelty had catalyzed so much positive change. The last I heard, she was living in a small town in another state, working as a part-time bookkeeper and keeping a very low profile. Her name still appeared on internet searches about HOA discrimination, a permanent reminder of the consequences of choosing fear over compassion. But more importantly, Marcus's name now appeared in searches about youth advocacy and inclusive community building. He had taken the worst moment of his childhood and transformed it into a lifelong mission to make the world more accessible for everyone. The morning sun streamed through my new office window at the Department of Justice as I prepared for another day of fighting housing discrimination cases. On my desk was a photo of Marcus at his high school graduation, wearing his cap and gown and standing proudly beside his walker, which he'd decorated with the logos of all the disability rights organizations he'd worked with over the years. Beside the photo was a letter from a family in Oregon whose HOA had tried to ban their autistic son from playing in their front yard. They'd seen our story online and had contacted my task force for help. Their case was scheduled for mediation next week, and I was confident we'd achieve a positive resolution without the need for lengthy litigation. That was perhaps the greatest victory of all, that our story had given other families the knowledge and courage to fight back against discrimination before it escalated to the level of assault and harassment that Marcus had endured. As I reviewed the Oregon family's file, I thought about the speech I'd be giving later that week at the National Fair Housing Conference. The title was, "From Driveway to DOJ: How Individual Cases Drive Systemic Change." It would tell the story of how one HOA president's moment of cruelty had ultimately strengthened civil rights protections for millions of Americans with disabilities. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Marcus, calling from his dorm room with an update on his latest advocacy project. "Dad, you're not going to believe this. Remember that art therapy program I've been trying to get funded at the Children's Hospital? They just approved it. Full funding for 5 years." I smiled, remembering the 12-year-old boy who had sat crying behind our rose bushes, his artwork destroyed and his dignity trampled. That little boy had grown into a young man who was changing the world, one program at a time. "That's incredible. Son, your mom would be so proud." "I know she would. Hey, Dad, I've been thinking about something. What if we wrote a book about all this, not just our story, but all the families who've gone through similar things? Maybe it could help other people understand their rights." It was a brilliant idea, the kind of forward-thinking approach that characterized everything Marcus did, a book that combined legal information with personal stories, making civil rights law accessible to ordinary families facing discrimination. "I think that's exactly what the world needs right now," I told him. "When do we start?" As we discussed the book project, I looked out my office window at the bustling streets of Washington, D.C. Somewhere out there, a child with a disability was being told they didn't belong in their own community. Somewhere, a family was being pressured to hide their loved one away from public view. But also, somewhere, advocates and allies were standing up to say that everyone deserves dignity, respect, and the right to exist openly in the world. The story that began with screams in a suburban driveway had become something larger than any of us could have imagined. It had become proof that when good people refuse to accept injustice, they can create change that ripples outward in ways that last for generations. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all, that ordinary moments can become extraordinary when we choose courage over comfort, justice over quiet, and love over fear. Linda Peterson had intended to make Marcus invisible, but instead, she had helped create a future where children like him would never have to hide who they are. The weight of justice, I had learned, is never too heavy to bear when it's carried by a community that refuses to look away from what's right.